This should be relatively entertaining. I'll give you guys a broad brush overview of supply chain security. First off, just by introduction, my name's Dan Rabinovitz. I come from the US. I live in Connecticut, just outside of New York City. I'm in pre-sales, so I work for GitLab. I'm a solution architect. It's basically a pre-sales engineer. I'm a reformed developer. I'm really good at asking AI to generate code for me these days. Before that, it was copy and paste. I've spent a lot of my career working with financial services and insurance companies, just given the proximity to New York City, and then in Hartford, Connecticut, they'll have insurers as well. When I'm not working, I have a 13-year-old son. He's very demanding, and I have to drive him around everywhere. And I also go to the gym, and I run as well, so I try to stay healthy. All right, before we get into the presentation, I want to talk about something that everybody's experienced this week, all the delicious food that we've eaten. So who went to Food Holland on Monday night? A lot of people. Who went to the networking reception last night and ate all the good food and drink there? All right, good. It's been a lot of great food. Who feels like this guy? All right, so when we think about what's going on here, so in the United States, and maybe in Europe as well, I'm not quite as familiar, we have a concept of an annual checkup with a doctor. And there are a lot of people in the United States, due to challenges with insurance and everything else, they don't like going to the doctor because you never know what you're gonna find. Maybe you have high blood pressure, maybe you're diabetic, maybe there's other ailments that you might have that need to get taken care of. And it can be very nervous and anxious going to the doctor for this annual checkup or any time. I know I don't like going to doctors anymore. I don't think anybody does and really enjoys it. How does this relate to software supply chain security? So if you think about your software supply chain, it's very complex. This is a simplified view. We can see things like development, where developers are pulling in code, they're pulling in dependencies. Maybe they're using AI. We have testing. You might have different testers. I know the shift left security has been hot for a while. Maybe you haven't fully implemented that yet. Then you have build, you have dependency management, you have deployment, and lastly, you have distribution. There's a lot of places in here that you have to think about securing this. And if you think about why this is important in Europe, we have the upcoming Cybersecurity Resilience Act. So, and this is going to be a big change. I'm not super familiar with this. It's actually another session going on right now talking about comparing the CRA to GDPR. So that'd be a good one to follow up on, look at the slides if you're not super familiar with what's going on with that. But at the end of the day, what this comes down to is when is the last time you've done a comprehensive checkup of your software supply chain? Customers I work with, they do this in bits and pieces, and we'll talk about what those bits and pieces are. I work at a lot of companies that are regulated. They have to provide evidence of deployment, of builds. They have to create SBOMs, and they do this, but they do it piecemeal. And there's no such, they usually typically don't do kind of a comprehensive audit, so you're missing pieces and you're exposing yourself to risk. The CRA, especially when that's going to take into account, that really introduces a lot of penalties for not really thinking about that risk. And where I am, if you don't adhere to the regulators, the federal regulators in the United States, that also introduces risk. It's a lot of fire drills to meet all their requirements. So having all of this done up front and on a regular basis really saves you time, it saves you money, and it reduces risk to your organization. All right, so let's talk about what some of the symptoms are about potentially poor digital risk, or digital health, I'm sorry. These risks are not theoretical, they're practical. When we look at some of the impacts of what's gone on recently over the past few years, there's been explosive growth in software supply chain attacks. So attacks doubled in 2024. There's been a 1,300% increase in malicious packages and open source repositories from 2020 to 2023. That's like not a typo, it's huge. It's a huge impact. Not only that, the average breach cost to remediate is just under $5 million US. That's a lot of developer salaries, that's a lot of increased spending, it's a lot of unplanned spending as well, when you think about that. And if we look at what's happening today and what Gartner says from an analysis standpoint, it's basically a coin flip as to whether or not your organization is going to suffer from one of these breaches in 2025. So some will, some won't. It's a pretty sobering statistic. I don't know how many people there are in this room, but if you look around, half of you work for organizations that might be impacted this year. That's a pretty startling number when you think about it. Some of the recent attacks, I think we all know about these: SolarWinds, Log4j, CodeCov. There have been more. There was an NPM package repository. Some NPM packages have been impacted earlier this year. The is package. There was an XZ vulnerability that was very elaborate in terms of how attackers attack that particular package, and that's in every Linux distribution that's out there today. So they aren't isolated incidents. All of these problems and all of these attacks, they're indicative of systemic health problems with our digital security and within our software ecosystem. So these are the things that we want to guard against. What are some of the unhealthy habits that we have? Well, dependency updates. I know from working with enterprise companies, oftentimes software is pinned to a specific version of a library that you've included or a developer has included. Well, that's great until someone discovers a vulnerability in that library, and then you have to go and figure out how to impact that. If we think about what Log4j happened, Log4j hit those organizations that have the oldest libraries the hardest. Third-party code. So I'm as guilty of this as many other people, given that I'm kind of a software developer for show in my job. I'll just do npm install and then whatever package I need to resolve my dependencies. I hope nobody in here does that, because then you don't really know what you're getting when you just do that. It's super easy, it's super convenient, it's like fast food. You can go and get that, you get that fixed, get full, get your build working, but how do you know that you haven't introduced a vulnerability to your software? Lack of visibility. So I went to a session yesterday talking all about SBOMs and why they're not sufficient. They're necessary but not sufficient, and there are ways around that. But it's still a necessity. It's still a necessity to have an SBOM. If you don't know what's in your software, how are you going to guard against any of these vulnerabilities? The last one here, rush to production without security checks. I've worked for startup companies before where it's get the code out at all costs. And that's great. It's great to get your code to market into customers' hands, but what happens if you inadvertently release a vulnerability or you release something with a secret in the code? Well, then you have reputational risk, you have revenue risk, whatever it might be. When you think about how all these relate together, they're all very small habits, but in conjunction, they really reinforce this kind of downward spiral in an organization to uncover all of, or potentially expose yourself to all these risks. And if you think about this and the way that I describe these, yeah, okay, you might skip your daily exercise, you might eat some fast food, you might kind of ignore those warning signs. But if you keep up with this, you're compounding risks to your organization. Let's talk about how we measure some of these, the vital signs, and how we measure and what are we going to look for within our software supply chain. So when we talked about the annual physical, you kind of get your blood work, maybe annually you get x-rays. Your code base needs comprehensive examination as well. So think about dependencies. I was looking at this earlier and talking to some of my colleagues. How many of you use any React frameworks in your development? No one? A couple, all right, one. So Next.js, which is an implementation of the React framework, I took a look at how many dependencies that uses. It's 652 when you think about all the dependencies and transitive dependencies. And you think about all those dependencies and what code is potentially in those dependencies, you're just kind of importing that library, using it in your code, but it's pulling in stuff from lots and lots of other places. Now that's just one example. Many packages have that many dependencies and more. Second one, you think about outdated packages. So this is something that you might not be aware of, and the CRA is going to force you to be aware of it very quickly. But there's typically no immediate symptoms here. Your code's working, it's building, your customers are happy with it, but how do you know if there's a problem with any of those, or how do you know if there's a security vulnerability? CVEs help, provided you're getting notified of those CVEs, but then you still have to take action. Unmaintained libraries. So similar to using older libraries, sometimes libraries aren't maintained. Sometimes the maintainers pass on maintenance to another maintainer, another open source owner of that. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just kind of fall off and development stops on those. Vulnerability scanning is helpful with this. So CVSS scores, I'm sure most people are familiar with CVSS scores. They're kind of at a score of 0 through 10. You can actually leverage this in a quick prioritization matrix to say, okay, well, these are critical, these are low. A lot of security scanners will help with that. We have one in GitLab. I've seen Sneak before, Veracode, checkmarks, doesn't matter. They're all gonna prioritize those vulnerabilities for you. False positives. So going back to the medical analogy, a lot of scanners are like hypochondriacs. They get very nervous, right? I see a nodding head here in the front. It's a challenge. I worked with an organization last year. They were using, actually I don't remember what scanner they were using. They came to us and said, our scanner is showing we have 1,200 vulnerabilities in our code. In reality, they're not gonna look through 1,200 vulnerabilities. It wasn't a huge software package. And after looking at it with them and kind of calming them down a little bit, it turned out that about 1,000 of them were either low or informational. So what value are those lower informational warnings? I mean, to someone, they're important. Otherwise, the security vendors wouldn't put them in there. But you have to be able to sort through all of that. When we think about some of the tools, so NPM can show you a dependency tree. Sneak, WhiteSource, FOSSA, they're all pretty good scanning tools. Libraries.io is a good site for package health metrics. Annual physicals kind of catch problems early, same with code audits, and same with running these scanners, and we'll talk about some techniques in a little bit as well. Let's talk about licenses now. So we talked about vulnerabilities and malicious and malware and people putting these into code, but what about licenses? Licenses can also be contagious as well within your organization. So if you think about the GPL license, it's been around for a while, but if you leverage code with a GPL license, you have to open source all of your code, which gets down to kind of this copyleft, the notion of copyleft, if you're familiar with that. There are other licenses that are also strong copyleft. We have one example here, so GPL and LGPL, they're still copyleft licenses, one stronger than the other based on implementation. There are lots and lots of open source licenses out there, as we all know. Commercial license violations, this comes up a lot, even organizations that I work with, and I work with very large organizations. You might inadvertently use an Oracle database driver. Oops. Then you gotta pay for it, right? You can't just assume that something is always gonna be free. So I put together this license database kind of chart here. I actually leveraged ChatGPT for this. It was pretty easy. It's fairly accurate. I recommend looking at the licenses that you use. You can compare them side by side. This is a quick and easy technique to use if you're not familiar with some of the licenses that are out there, because there are a lot. There are a lot of different open source licenses. So when you think about this, I equate this to like getting your blood work done. When you get your blood work done, you have no idea what's going to show up. Your doctor's going to do the complete blood count and check for lots of different things. Same thing with licenses. Once you start unpacking this, you're going to uncover things in your organization about licenses that you're using, whether intentional or unintentional, and then start looking at the implications of that. All right, let's talk about code provenance verification. So this is important being we're at an open source conference. So DNA can reveal parentage, genetic disorders. Same thing when we start to take a look at where our code came from. So when we think about authenticity, this is kind of where typo squatting comes in. You think you might download a package with a particular version, maybe you mistyped it, then you got something else. Reputation scoring. So you think about maintainers of these open source projects, Linus being the most famous one out there, but they're maintainers. And how long have they been a maintainer for? Can you trust them? They have to build a reputation in the community to be able to be knowledgeable about what they're doing. Download source. So this is like getting your medications from like the pharmacist versus like somebody on the street or maybe a coffee shop here in Amsterdam. You don't really know what you're getting, right? You want to leverage these package managers. You want to leverage authentic sources for the code. Some of the coffee shops look really nice, by the way. I saw a bunch at night. They were all lit up. Very enticing. I didn't go in, though. We think about things like integrity checks. We want to check hashes of our code. That's how some of these vulnerabilities that I mentioned earlier were actually caught, because the hash didn't match when somebody took a look at it and they said, I don't think this is exactly right. And then you look at the hash versus what you're using versus what's in the package registry. You want to make sure you check that. I know myself, given I'm kind of a developer to make things work, I'll do npm install and I won't even look at the hash. But it's certainly as a proper software developer, you'd want to check that. Again, there are lots of tools out there to help you with this. Libraries.io I mentioned before, there's deps.dev. There are lots of tools to be able to help you manage this. When we think about this, modern supply chain security, I talked a lot about vulnerabilities, but it's also about authenticity and trustworthiness as well. And they all factor in to be able to create a secure software supply chain. Let's talk a little bit about monitoring now. So we talked about kind of some of the underlying things that we have to look for. How do we actually monitor this? So some of these tools, I'm sure people are familiar with. There's a long list of tools that are out there. SAST and DAS scanners, they're like blood pressure checks. They're typically quick, they're routine. You can run SAS scans at rest, you can run DAS scans for a running app. They're very quick. They'll find things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, they'll find hard-coded secrets. These can be automated. They can be automated to run on a schedule. They can be automated to run at code check-in. And there are lots and lots of scanners that do this. So SCA, software composition analysis, this is kind of the blood work. It's kind of what's in your bloodstream. This can reveal hidden risks. So SCA was able to catch the log4j vulnerability as an example. SBOMs, I've heard a lot about SBOMs this week. There's another vendor across the aisle from us that has a solution all around SBOMs. This helps you look at kind of your complete medical record. So it gives you your ingredient list. So the example going back to a reference, do we use log4j? What versions are we using in our organization? And I can find this pretty quickly from an SBOM. Now, this is great, but I'm going to take this back to a bit of a medical analogy. You need an integration point for all these. So we have all these different checks. It's like going to the hospital and getting a comprehensive checkup. Now, you can automate these, run these in parallel, run these throughout the year. So you don't necessarily have to go and do this all at once. But if you haven't done this, you probably should. All right, AI. No presentation will be complete without mentioning the word AI. For those of you that went to the keynote yesterday, I have not fulfilled my AI quota, so we're going to talk about AI, right? It's super important. This is, it's a pretty morbid graphic here. It's a little bit washed out, but it really is the silent spreader that's going on today in software development. I've read a few studies. Depending on the study you read, somewhere between 40 and 60% of organizations have an approved AI policy and tool within their organization. Sounds great, but 90% of developers are using an AI tool on a daily basis to get their job done. So what's going on there, right? Obviously, some people are using their phones, ChatGPT. Some people work for organizations where access to AI tools might not be blocked. So it's in use today, and it's happening in just about every organization. So this is, it's there, and it's causing problems. So there are a number of things to look out for. The kind of first one around models, you got to be careful with what you get back from AI, right? They're kind of like contaminated supplements. They appear highly beneficial, but it could be harmful to your organization, right? It's very easy to get low quality code back from an LLM. Very, very easy. So another one, kind of backdoor attacks and pre-trained models. So the model works most of the time, but if you're really good at prompt engineering, you can output vulnerable code very easily. And there's lots of documentation about this for how to get ChatGPT and others to output bad code. So detection strategies. This kind of gets down to the zero trust paradigm of software development. You got to inspect what comes out of these models. You really want to test that code with known attack patterns. You want to run it through those scanners. You can actually verify models against each other. I had a discussion yesterday at the booth with someone who was generating code from one model and then using a different model to analyze that code and review that code. So you can kind of like cross the models with each other. Prompt injection. This is pretty well known at this point. There was a fun exercise that the security company Wiz put together earlier this year all about prompt injection. They had a website and a kind of pseudo LLM, and they had instructions, and they made it a game. Can you figure out what the bad prompts are to get root access to this pseudo website? And it was shockingly easy to do. So we think about how we do that. Code generation vulnerabilities. This one should be pretty obvious. It's pretty easy to get bad code out of these LLMs. So it's pretty easy to get code that has SQL injection risks or cross-site scripting risks or other risks out of this code. Again, scanners will catch these, and they'll prevent them from being merged into your main branch. Mitigation techniques. So depending on what vendor you're using, oftentimes the inputs are sanitized. If you're using GitHub Copilot or GitLab or Cursor or any one of these other tools that's going to suggest code for you, there's a bit of pre-processing going on to hopefully mitigate the risk of getting vulnerable or bad code out of the model. You never know, but hopefully it's mitigated. Human review is another technique. I don't know about your organizations. Most organizations I work with, before you merge into a protected branch or a main branch of your code, typically 2 human reviewers are required. So pretty quick and easy thing. You can implement those merge request approvals or pull request approvals with a number of different software packages. What's really key here is this is kind of the new frontier in software supply chain security. It's hard to remember kind of the before days of before AI, but it's only been around for like 2.5 years. OpenAI was released in November of 2022. It seems like a lifetime ago, I know, because now it's everywhere, but we're still learning how to adapt to this. And now it's not on this slide, but we have agentic AI. These AI agents, now they can interact with your code in ways that you might not intend. But they're here, and people are going to take advantage of them. I think AI agents are very powerful. I don't think it's hype. I think it's going to be here, and I think that we have to adapt to that in our software development lifecycle. So as we think about this, I think that there are going to be new categories of tools to help prevent some of these AI vulnerabilities. I think we don't know a lot yet. I think companies are going to have to implement security tools to help us as we continue to use AI in our jobs. Diving down one level deeper into what some of these risks are, I think people have seen some of these risks as well. They're all new. So AI-generated code. Think about this like an experimental treatment for some type of cancer or something like that. Might be helpful, might not be helpful, but you're experimenting on yourself when you do this. Integration risks. So all these code generation tools, they're all embedded in IDEs, or some have their own IDEs now. How is that integration happening? How can you be sure that your data is securely going from that model vendor to the IDE and being leveraged in your code? Licensing ambiguity. So you can probably ask a model to generate code that uses a certain license, but you're going to have to be really sure that you're in compliance with whatever code is generated. It might not be straightforward, depending on what the code is that you get back. Similarly with commercial code. You might get back code from an LLM that's commercially available. It's been well publicized that the LLM model vendors are kind of sucking in everything on the internet to trade their models. So you can't be sure that you're getting open source code back from a model to just go and reuse. When we think about this, And kind of there's deep fakes, there's posing as company officials. That actually the most well-known vulnerability that I found about that, doing a little bit of research, there's obviously one that had a big financial implication for a bank that wasn't really AI, but the XZ vulnerability, and that's in every Linux distribution, that was a very elaborate phishing scam that took about 2 years from start to when it was actually discovered. Started out as phishing, somebody got access to the code base, put in malicious code. It wound up in testing branches of every major Linux distribution, and it was a bit of a mess, but it went undiscovered for 2 years. What are some best practices around this? So again, this is my take, but we're still early on. We're still learning in terms of what some of these best practices are. It's nice to say, source verification for ML models. In reality, I don't think OpenAI is going to tell you where they get all their data from. But you can certainly verify the latest versions of GPT-5. If you use ChatGPT, you can push a little button and say explain, or it'll give you the source, so you can then go and verify that what you're using doesn't use an invalid license. It's not commercial code, whatever it is. Works a little bit differently in IDEs with code, but I know within the interface it has that. Similarly with training data, this is actually a lot more useful for companies who host their own models. So I work a lot with organizations for a variety of reasons. They can't use OpenAI's models. They can't use Anthropic's models for regulatory concerns, for privacy concerns. So then you have a lot of control over how you train your model. Obviously, there's a lot of maintenance there. You have to have the NVIDIA GPUs to run them. But then you can be sure that what you're getting back is not going to cause any vulnerabilities or any license issues or any dependency issues in your code. AI code review. So I mentioned before, a lot of organizations have this kind of multiple approval approach in place. I've seen very elaborate variations of that as well. We talk about security scanning for AI-generated code. This is where I think we're still learning in terms of how we adapt these. So traditional SaaS security scanners, they'll catch some vulnerabilities in AI-generated code, but if you think about what's being generated from AI, a lot of it we haven't seen yet. It's mixing and matching from LLMs, so we have to be very careful about that. There are a lot of different tools out there. MLflow can be used for model tracking. SemGrep is a great open source SaaS scanner. There are a lot of other third-party proprietary scanners as well. So very powerful, new. I think it's going to cause some more problems in this space in the short term, but I think longer term as this becomes more mainstream, we get to use this more, use this technology more, understand what agents can do since they're still very, very new. We can then start to adapt our security measures and our security posture to use them in a way that's powerful and improves our developers' experience, but while not introducing additional risk. All right, let's talk a little bit about dependencies. Dependencies are critical. I talked before about the next.js package. Every package has lots of dependencies. So we're going to call this the elimination diet for dependencies. I think the goal of everybody in this room should be to create the highest quality software possible with the fewest number of third-party dependencies. It's a very aspirational goal, I know, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. But you have to figure out what's essential versus what's convenient. So if we think about this, there might be redundant packages that you're pulling in. You might have multiple JSON parsers. You might have 3 different HTTP clients in your code. And you might have 5 utility libraries that do the same thing. You should start to think about what those dependencies are and try and slim that down a little bit. So necessity versus convenience. The example I found, there are libraries that will indent your code and pad your code correctly. Well, do you really need that if you're writing 25 lines of code? Can you just go and tab correct it yourself as opposed to introducing a package that will help you fix it? So the technical debt, like this notion of dependency debt, I found a lot of different examples of how to calculate this. This is one example, but it's a weighted score. You want to create a weighted score, and this can be adapted to your organization to figure out what your dependency debt is. And this one has kind of different weights, 40%, 30%, 20%, and 10%. But you're factoring in things like a security risk, so you can get this from a CVSS score. A maintenance risk, so what's the risk in your environment to upgrading these dependencies? Update lag risk, how timely are you? And then license risk, whatever this might be. A lot of the models that I've seen for this, they typically recommend using kind of a 0 through 10 score. But again, you can adapt this to your organization, but you should think about how you're going to calculate what your dependency debt is in your organization. Similarly, we talk about removals. So how do we remove these? So you can create a risk value matrix, kind of 2 by 2, high, low. What's the risk? What's the value for each one of these dependencies? It's probably not feasible to do this for everything, every dependency in your organization, but certainly for the ones that are most utilized, the ones that are the oldest, to sit down and think about, okay, am I getting the value out of this for the risk, depending on the version, et cetera, like that. And then obviously you want to be able to sunset deprecated libraries. So what's that going to look like in your organization? This is really no different than planning for technical debt. Every company in the world has technical debt, even if they're a startup company. I'm sure they have technical debt. Nobody likes working on technical debt. All the developers want to work on the hottest, latest thing. Nobody wants to go take a look at this old code and figure out how to refactor it and make it more secure and make it more up to date. Same thing with figuring out what your deprecated libraries are and how to replace them. It's just another form of technical debt. This technical debt introduces risk to your organization, though. All right, how do we start to prevent some of this? I've talked a lot about all the negative aspects of security, software supply chain security, and all the bad things that can happen. Let's start talking about how we can shift the narrative and make this better and improve this in your organization. We want to start to build up our organization's immune system through some best practices. So least privileged access, this is fairly common. It applies to dependencies as well. Obviously, your developers aren't going to have root access to your system. You don't want your libraries to have root access either. You want to limit the scope of that. Sandboxing and isolation techniques. So if you do have dependencies that are older, or maybe they have a CVSS score that's very high, you put them in a different environment and make sure that they're not exploited in the way that you're using them. If they are, you can figure out a way to prevent that. Runtime protection. So what do you do when your code's running? So DAST scans are kind of an easy way to identify that. Container scanning is another way to look for containers. You can isolate your containers. You can look for unexpected network calls. This is how some of the attacks that I mentioned earlier were caught. They were making quieter but SSH calls, not as frequent, to third-party servers and sending back information. Or they were accepting remote procedure calls. The zero trust dependency model, basically never trust, always verify, even in your dependencies. It applies to API calls, inputs, any action that your application takes. I've worked for testing companies in the past as well, software testing companies. You can automate a lot of this as well through testing, whether it's through unit testing, whether it's through user experience testing, whether it's through kind of Selenium type customer and user testing, depending on what your application is. But there are ways to test this pretty easily. There are lots of different things that you can do here. There are lots of different policies that you can implement using various tools, things like container system. You can introduce different security tools in this as well. But what we're doing is we're building up the immune system in our organization through the use of these best practices. All right, let's talk about some kind of longer term organizational wellness that we can think about here. So healthy people don't think about what they do on a daily basis. They breathe, they eat, maybe you exercise if you have a good habit. It's all automatic. Your security posture should be automatic as well. So this notion of kind of real-time vulnerability reports, a lot of tools send notifications automatically. Sneak, Dependabot, you'll get notifications when new CVEs are discovered. You don't have to wait, so you can take action quicker. Automated dependency updates. This one's kind of easier said than done, depending on how your application works. I know that, we all have iPhones or Androids. They have automated updates, but if you update something might break. Maybe you want to wait, especially with kind of the core operating system. Same thing with dependencies. If you have a dependency on a specific version of a library, maybe you can't automate this. You can't automate an update. Policy compliance. So when you think about what you've implemented for a CI tool, you want to have pipeline steps to prevent some of this from happening. So in a CI tool, maybe you call a third-party scanner and you stop the pipeline if that third-party scanner uncovers a vulnerability. Or a license restriction. GPL is the example here. If you want to make sure you don't have any GPL-based code in your application, you don't want that to build. How about what can we do on a regular basis? Well, we can do kind of weekly reviews. We can do systematic reviews. We can generate dependency health reports. We can generate SBOMs. We can compare those. So SBOMs are a couple standard formats. It could be SPDX, it could be Cyclone DX. They're JSON formats. You can compare those pretty easily from week to week or month to month in your application. We can start to take a look at metrics on a longer time horizon. So things like monthly assessments, we can look at vulnerability density as an example. I've never seen a piece of code or an application that has 0 vulnerabilities. Doesn't exist. But you can have all low or informational or all medium, and you want to track those trends over time. And then we start to talk about this notion of an annual physical, going back to how I started the presentation. That's where you kind of want to do a deeper dive audit of your organization. You can do it quarterly, semi-annually. It's an intensive process, but it needs to be done. How about a security-first culture? So how many people in the room have been trained on how to write secure code? That's maybe 5%, maybe 10%. So there are organizations out there. So there's a company called Secure Code Warrior, another called Contra, that will help your developers and help you to understand how to write secure code. Similarly, you can educate developers on things like CVE scores, CVSS scores, on licenses, what makes a maintainer trustworthy, things like that. So when we think about planning security, so threat modeling workshops, things like this. What does a threat look like? You can sit down and figure out what all those different threat vectors are, and then you can try to attack them during a hackathon or similar. How do we exploit that code? Policy implementation. So if we think about this, we want everybody to follow the same rules. Policies will allow you to do that. Typically, it's through a pipeline, could be through third-party tools as well. Simplest one is a certain number of approvers that are required. They can get much more elaborate from there. Security review gates, I talked a little bit before about stopping pipelines. If you fail a security review or you have too many vulnerabilities. And then, well, what happens if an incident does occur? How are you going to be prepared for the next Log4j incident? How is it not going to catch you flat-footed? We talk about some of the metrics. So these are not comprehensive by any means, but when I was preparing for this, I found a few metrics. So mean time to patch, kind of a general industry average for security vulnerability patching that I found is about 60 days, with high-performing teams patching vulnerabilities within less than a week. Vulnerability density, how many vulnerabilities do you have per dependencies or per lines of code, depending on what the metrics are. What I would target is less than 5 critical vulnerabilities per 100 dependencies, red flag if you got more than 20. And these could be easily identified through a security scanner. Then you kind of get into some more elaborate metrics around security debt or supply chain risk scores. There are lots of different ways to combine this. I found lots of different formulas, but you're looking at things like dependency age, maintainer reputation, vulnerability count, and license compliance for the former. And the latter is basically the same, but minus license compliance. So we're trying to figure out these metrics to know if we're in compliance or not. And then we can take these metrics, we can apply them, we can evaluate them over time and look at trends. All right, so I kind of like this as like the good analogy here is the Mediterranean diet of software development. So Mediterranean diets, for those of anybody who's ever been on a Mediterranean diet, they're pretty good. You can eat a lot of foods. There's a lot of foods you can eat on them. And it's a sustainable lifestyle more than anything else. It's not a crash diet. You don't do this. We just had a whole thing in the United States about The Biggest Loser. There's a documentary on Netflix. Those people were losing 25 pounds a week, and that's not healthy. That's the crash diet. They all gained it back. Mediterranean diets are sustainable for the long term, and that's a similar approach that you should have in your organization when it comes to security around your software supply chain. When I think of what this is, it's looking at well-maintained libraries, well-maintained dependencies, and staying up to date. How do we apply updates? Well, you're not going to go and update every single package that your software depends on all at once, because then your code's probably going to break, and then two, you're going to have to resolve all that. So how do we take this in small, manageable bites to be able to update this? You want to diversify your security tooling. I still work with a lot of organizations who are very narrowly focused in their security tools. They might have a SaaS tool, they might have a DAS tool, they don't have an SCA tool, they don't really look at their SBOMs, and these are huge financial services companies, and there are gaps in the tooling that they use. You need to diversify. And then AI is going to add a layer onto this, as we discussed. Community engagement peer review is an interesting one, because we're all in an open source conference. So if you identify something, help fix it, right? There's, in New York, the New York City subways, there's this slogan of see something, if you see something, say something. It's the same thing. Like, we're all here at an open source conference. We should all be comfortable contributing to these open source projects to improve the experience for everyone. The key takeaway here is security is not about being perfect. It's not about having a perfect, disciplined approach to security. It's about having a sustainable practice that you can gradually improve over time. All right, getting towards the end here. So what's the prescription look like? When we think about this, the call to action's kind of two-phase. First call to action, then I'm going to call this the 90-day action plan. Might take longer in your organization depending on where you work. But first thing you have to do is complete this supply chain audit. That means looking at licenses. It means looking at dependencies. It means looking at all of your source code, looking at scan results, vulnerabilities, everything. Next few weeks, well, how are we going to know if we improve? We have this audit. We have our baseline. We want to implement some monitoring to help improve. Then dependency cleanup. Well, depending on where you are, this could take, I know it says 3 weeks here, it might take a little bit more or less, depending on where you are, but dependencies are going to be critical to cleaning up your software supply chain. And then how do we establish an ongoing process? Remember, this isn't a one-time thing. It's about gradual improvement over time and building sustainable practices in your organization. All right, so last slide, last takeaways here. Prevention's cheaper than the cure. So remember, before it was about close to $5 million for an average security breach. This is much less expensive if you do it up front. This is the way I'd equate this. It's like spending money on a monthly gym membership so you don't have to go and have bypass surgery later on in life. Regular checkups. So you want to be able to detect things early. You want to run those scanners early. Small daily practices build big results. So this is all about compounding, the compounding effects of running these scanners daily, checking your dependencies daily to build on that. So lastly, your organization's health is in your hands, everybody in this room. The tools are available. The time to start looking at this is now. There are a lot of other sessions that go way deeper into a lot of these tools. This is meant to be a broad brush, but the tools are out there. So don't wait for the heart attack. Start your digital wellness journey today. Thank you very much.